Hello, my name is Tony Kushner, and I'm going to give you an overview of British refugee and immigration policy from the late 17th century through to the Kindertransport, 1938-39. And the intention is to sort of put this into a wider context of settlement of refugees and responses of the state to refugees, so that we see the Kindertransport as part of what is unique about it, but also where it fits into wider tendencies. So I'm going to start very briefly in the late 17th century, in the arrival of the Huguenot refugees. These are Protestants in France who are being persecuted by the Catholic regime of Louis XIV, and they come to Britain after the toleration that had been given to the Huguenots is ended in 1685, and that leads to an influx of roughly 50,000 refugees into Britain. And the term itself develops from this time. The refugees, the Huguenots, create this term themselves to give the sense that they are different, that they deserve sympathy, that they've been persecuted, but also that they're going to come here, they're going to be very valuable to Britain as in their economy. And why they are let in reflects not necessarily a sympathy with all foreigners. Indeed, there is a sort of very strong anti-French feeling in Britain at this time, which continues thereafter. Anti-Catholicism is part of that, but there is sympathy to them as victims of the persecution of what is seen as an intolerant regime of Louis XIV, a sort of despotic regime. So it's not that they are welcomed with open arms, but they are accepted in, they're allowed the right to practice their form of Protestant Calvinist religion freely, and they contribute thereafter in various aspects, most famously in the silk industry, but also in creation of scientific instruments, clocks and the like. So the term refugee develops from that point. But it's important to recognise that until the early 20th century, the free movement of people, apart from at particular times of conflict, is taken for granted. That there is no permanent immigration control in Britain, or for that matter, many other nation states across the world at this point. So this may seem a very unusual situation from our position today in the 21st century, a world of borders, restrictions and walls and so on. And it doesn't necessarily mean that people, when they get here, are particularly welcomed. There is a sort of xenophobia, anti-foreigner sentiment in many of them, but the idea that they should be allowed to travel freely, but also that refugees, especially in Britain, were greeted with some understanding that the right to asylum, the right to escape persecution and be allowed asylum in Britain, is part of its self-belief right through the 19th century. It's a very powerful one. And then underneath it, there's assumptions to an extent that Britain is more successful, is more decent than the countries that are persecuting people and dumping them into Britain. So if we take someone like Karl Marx, who comes to Britain in 1849 as a refugee, in this case escaping, having left Germany but escaping France, he's not, his ideas are not welcome whatsoever, but there's a sort of self-confidence that Britain will be immune to his communist beliefs, and that he can be allowed. And that's a very, very important principle to public opinion and influential figures throughout the 19th century. And it comes under threat in the late 19th century when perhaps that self-confidence is undermined, as Britain's industrial position is under threat, its empire is under threat, there's competition and military competition. And in that growing world of uncertainty in the late 19th, early 20th century, I think it's no accident we get the first move to have a permanent measure of immigration control. And in 1905, the Aliens Act is passed. It is, by the standards of today, a very weak measure. It only applies to poor people, people travelling third class or steerage. If you're travelling second class, first class, you're not part of its regulations. And on top of all of that, there is a sort of clause, the asylum clause, that says that if you say that you are a victim of persecution, of religious or political persecution, that you will be immune from the controls that have been implemented. So the Asylum Act is almost like a sort of get out of jail free card. Makes it very difficult for the small number of officers that were created by the Home Office and its Aliens Department after 1906 and the implementation of the Act. Because if an immigrant says that they're a refugee, initially at least, the immigration officers have to take their word for it. It's the absolute reverse today, where the immigrant, those claiming asylum, have to prove beyond any doubt, any reasonable doubt, that they are indeed victims of persecution. But it's an indication of how powerful that belief in asylum was, that it was the only way eventually that the Conservative government that put it forward could get it through. So it was amended, made a much weaker measure. But though that very tentative measure is itself important because it is sort of symbolic of getting over the hurdle, the sort of psychological hurdle, if you like, of having permanent controls at all. But with the First World War, all of that tentativeness disappears almost overnight. And it becomes a very, very strong position of anti-alienism throughout the war, particularly against those who are seen as enemy aliens, those of German origin or Austrian origin, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Germany, who are in turn deported, their wealth is confiscated. But even then, there is a sort of remnant of refugee policy, and quite a spectacular one at that. The largest and fastest movement of refugees in British history occurs during the First World War, and particularly in the first months of the war, in late summer and autumn 1914, with the arrival of up to 250,000 Belgian refugees, who are initially welcomed. And they're welcome because they're seen as victims of the nasty Germans, the nasty Hun. All sorts of stories about German atrocities are put out by the media and by the government. And the Belgians are seen as a sort of innocent victims, and there's an element of guilt perhaps as well. I think guilt is always an element in refugee policy, that we haven't been able to protect them militarily at the start of the war. So the Belgians settled. There are literally thousands of local committees across the United Kingdom looking after the Belgian refugees. And as I'll highlight shortly, within them there are quite a lot of children. There are injured soldiers, obviously male at this point, but there are also families that come and children as part of that. And there are other refugees in smaller number that come in the First World War that you could argue are a sort of precedent for the Kindertransport. In 1919, what had been an emergency measure of alien control becomes permanent with the Aliens Restriction Act of 1919, and that is renewed every year through an aliens order. And from being this very tentative and partial measure of control in 1905, we now have almost total immigration control. We don't really have the asylum clause. What the state says in the 1920s is it will let individual refugees in if it deems them to be good for the public, for Britain's good overall, but generally that asylum clause is gone. There is no longer that right to claim asylum in Britain, and there's no international protection of refugees in terms of something like the United Nations Declaration on Refugees, the Geneva Declaration of 1951. So states can choose whether to let refugees in or not. And through the 1920s, the British government's response is pretty much not to. And even those who are just normal migrants are finding it very, very difficult to come in. You've got to have a job to come to and prove that no one else can do it. You've got, or that you've got someone to support you, or that you've got enough wealth yourself. So people who have got specific skills are recruited, but the numbers are very small. And I think this is indicated in the 1920s, where you have it's near where Southampton International Airport is today, Atlantic Park Hostel, which was the largest transmigrant camp in Europe at this point, with thousands of migrants who are stranded. They are stranded because they have got to America, and America's implemented immigration controls, particularly in 1921 and 1924, where there are quotas, and these are very much based on race. So that if you're from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, or Chinese, it's very, very hard to get into America. Country of free entry, Statue of Liberty and all that is no longer a place of immigration entry. So the shipping companies are liable to looking after these refugees as they return to the port they left from Southampton, and they're stuck there for years, unable to go back to where they come from mainly from the Ukraine, where there's civil war, famine, and very murderous attacks, particularly on Jews and other minorities. But they're not allowed to stay either. Britain will not accept their entry. These are East European Jews, and they're not welcomed at all. So they slowly, the hundreds of thousands there, slowly find places to go to in Latin America and other parts of the world. And a few are lucky and manage to get to America with family support, but they're the exceptions rather than the rule. So that takes us to the position in 1933, so that Britain no longer has a sort of generous policy of refugee entry. It will only allow those that it deems to be not a risk, and certainly not as a right, and generally there's a restriction against migration, particularly those who are deemed to be undesirable types of people, those from Eastern Europe especially. So it seems surprising in that light that Britain should have any refugee policy at all of any note during the Nazi era. And we can be very, I think, rightly critical of some of the restrictionism that Britain imposed, including its mandate over Palestine, which had taken over collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the First World War, and some of the restrictions that are placed on migrants in the 1930s. But nevertheless, it's surprising in the context of the 1920s that so many people are allowed entry. And Louise London, who's the foremost scholar of this movement, suggests that as many as 80,000 people were allowed entry between 1933 and the outbreak of the Second World War. And the figure is somewhere between 60 and 80,000. Now, there are things we need to keep in mind about that number. First of all, that the almost all of them came on temporary visas and transit visas, so they meant to go on to other places, and many of them did. So at the outbreak of war, perhaps 56,000 are still present in Britain, and even those, many of them were expected to leave. There are recruitment of some refugees who are talented scientists or industrialists, so the government began showing self-interest there. But the other factor, which I think is critical, is that the Anglo-Jewish, the British Jewish organisations, say to the government in 1933, we will make sure these refugees are not a charge on the state. It won't be a matter of public funds being used to support them. The British government, I think, was convinced that that was a genuine offer, and that they relied on the integrity of these British Jewish organisations to fulfil their pledge, and that's pretty much what happened. The numbers are quite small, 10 or 11,000 are the numbers present in Britain pretty much from 1933 to 36 or 37. There are small numbers coming in and larger numbers going out. That does change in 1938. There is an opening up of temporary permits. 20,000 women are allowed in as domestic servants, almost all of them Jewish, and that's a sort of mixture of self-interest, shortage of servants, alongside the desire to sort of help people at risk. So it's sort of self-interest and philanthropy going alongside each other. So what the situation about 1935, 1936, as a Ministry of Labour official, Humbert Wolff, said that we've not really changed the aliens legislation either in favour of or against refugees, so letting in small numbers, and often those are sort of carefully selected. So there is a change in 1938, and it partly reflects the desperate need of Jews, particularly after the Anschluss, which adds another 200,000 Jews alongside the 500, 600,000 German Jews who are trying to escape, and in the case of the Austrian Jews, with all the measures implemented very quickly, doing so with great desperation. And then that move to sort of gently open up with visas and so on, again carefully selected, intensifies with the Kristallnacht pogrom of the 9th and 10th November 1938, which is in very public viewing. This is reported across the world, so it's hardly disguised. Over 100 Jews murdered, tens of thousands put in concentration camps, and a night of vicious murder and violence and robbery and intimidation. And it's in that context that the same Jewish organizations go to the government and say that they would like to let in support the entry of refugee children to Britain, Jewish refugee children. And the British government is sympathetic to that. I think that's one of the most important things to remember of that movement of what becomes 10,000 children, is that it wasn't a state scheme. It was a private scheme supported by individuals, ordinary people, and refugee organisations. But although it was made clear in a parliamentary debate and agreed to in parliamentary debate on 21st of November 1938, that actually this was a ordinary scheme, not a government scheme, that was implemented. Initially, there's no limit on numbers. But there are, again, restrictions we could keep in mind. That the children, almost all of them on temporary permits, are not meant to settle permanently. And of course, they were coming on their own, unaccompanied children, and not with their parents. Some were very fortunate and their parents were able to come through other means, through the domestic service scheme or other schemes. But the majority came without their parents, and many of those would never see their parents again. And there was an awareness that there were limitations to the scheme when it was announced in the House of Commons as well. So it's a desperate scheme at a desperate moment, but we need to keep it into that context of refugee policy as a whole in the 1930s, with its generosity but also its limitations. So the idea was that the children would be maybe educated here, but would move on to other places at some point in the future. And many of them actually did. It is, and I'd like to sort of finish, it's an exceptional scheme in its way, and of course it saved many lives, all with hindsight. But it also was not sort of the first time that children have been allowed in as refugees. I mentioned the Belgian refugees. The children didn't come separately, but were part of the wider movement of children, of Belgian families, and were educated in Belgian schools. So there's the idea of separate treatment of them and separate needs for them. At the same time, about 300 Serbian boys were allowed into Britain, again on a temporary basis, as were the Belgians. And these were seen as a sort of training through the schools in Britain, these 300 Belgian boys and a handful of girls, that they would be the leaders to revive the Serbian nation after the First World War. So there is a precedent there. And then the more immediate one was in 1937, when 4,000 Basque children fleeing from the Spanish Civil War were allowed into Britain. Again, a private scheme. The British government were quite uneasy about it, really didn't want it to happen, but public opinion pushed it through. And we see that through that, and also a smaller scheme run by Save the Children from 1936 onwards allows in a small number of refugee children from Nazi Germany. So there are precedents, but nothing as big as the Kindertransport, which, as I said, was open-ended to begin with. So it's a very important scheme, but it's important to put it into context, important to see how much was achieved and the support of ordinary people, not all of whom treated the children as we'd have wanted them to. And there was very little vetting of the suitability of the foster parents, for example, with the inevitable results that there was some abuse, very sadly, of these children. But many others who were treated as if they were family, and we should sort of rightly celebrate that, but also see some of the limitations of the scheme and where it fits within a wider context of British refugee policy and immigration policies, which really, as I say, could start in the late 17th century, but certainly it's part of a pattern of the interwar period. Thank you very much.